Merdeka! Merdeka! Merdeka penuh!
Hello, and welcome to our presentation on the region of Papua through the perspective of peace and conflict studies. My name is Sam Clancy, and my group members are William Koller, Moses Sana, and Kazuma Tsunami. Our primary focus is on the independence, or rather the continued lack thereof, for the western half of the island of Papua, currently administered by the Republic of Indonesia from Jakarta. As a group, we ultimately support the independence of Western Papua, as we believe it would most effectively end the conflict in the region. However, there is a lengthy process of dialogue and reconciliation to occur before that can happen. This process must take into consideration the similarities and differences between Indonesian and Papuan people, the history of their relationship and of the respective histories of Indonesia and Papua, the resources and economic power dynamics within the region, as well as the violence, structural and direct, that has taken place on Papua. To understand the Papuan situation, it is important to understand the actors within. Since 1963, when control over the region was ultimately given to Indonesia by the United Nations after an extended period of conflict, there have been only two: the local Papuan people and the Indonesian government. The Indonesian government is based in the capital city of Jakarta on the island of Java, and administers somewhere between 15 and 18,000 islands of the Indonesian archipelago. While Indonesia is thus quite diverse thanks to each island's regional and tribal, historical and cultural development, the vast majority are still related fairly closely to Jakarta ethnically and the main island of Java, by extension, due to its population and political, financial and societal power. The people of Papua are, unsurprisingly, much closer related ethnically and culturally to Melanesian people, the ethnic group that make up the majority of nations such as Papua New Guinea, with whom they share a land border, the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and some indigenous Australian people groups as well. Because of Indonesia's vast military, economic, and political resources, particularly in comparison with Papua's itself, they are able to abuse their power and retain control over the region, with particular details explained later. Indonesia is incredibly unwilling to lose its control over Papua due to immense natural resources. Another point to consider is the social or political impact on the nation's elite should the nation quote-unquote lose West Papua in the same way it quote-unquote lost East Timor to a begrudged independence. Being an island nation, there is a long history of maritime transport throughout the archipelago. Historically, the Papuan people were incredibly well-travelled, thanks to their canoe boats manned by 20-odd physically strong men, meaning they could travel long distances with relative ease given the technology they had. However, as maritime technology developed in other nations, the Papuans remained using their manual canoes. This eventually allowed other powers to gain control of the waters within the archipelago, firstly by the old kingdoms in the region, the Indonesians, then eventually the Europeans, with the arrival of Dutch, Portuguese, and British ships centuries later. Despite Dutch influence from as early as the mid-17th century, it was not until the late 19th century that a successful European colony was settled. From then until 1949, the region was governed by the Dutch government as part of the Dutch East Indies. When the Dutch granted independence to the Republic of Indonesia in 1949, they sought to retain colonial possession of the territory and governed it as the Netherlands New Guinea. Indonesia protested this, as it claimed all territory of the Dutch East Indies as its own. In 1961, with Dutch support, West Papua declared independence, which prompted the Indonesian government and subsequently the Indonesian military to launch an operation in West Papua to take control of it. In 1963, through United Nations mediation, control of West Papua was transferred from the Netherlands to the Republic of Indonesia. While there was periods of direct and indirect structural violence during this long history, the so-called Act of Free Choice in 1969 is the most egregious example of structural violence in Papuan history, and perhaps one of the most severe in all of history. The Act of Free Choice, as it was named, was intended to be a referendum with votes of all people in West Papua to be counted, with two outcomes being presented: integration with Indonesia or independence. Despite a local Papuan population of more than 800,000 people, only 1,025 men were chosen by the Indonesian military commander in charge of the region to respond to the vote. The result was thus overwhelmingly in support for integration with Indonesia. This vote ignored the wishes of almost all of the population of West Papua by design. Due to the result of the Act of Free Choice, though, West Papua was renamed to Irian Jaya and became a province of the Republic of Indonesia. Another Indonesian policy that is an example of structural violence by the Indonesian government against the people of Papua is the transmigrasi policy. The policy was designed to relieve the main island of Java's immense overpopulation problem. However, in Papua, it also had the effect of diluting the local population, reducing their proportion of the population in the region. It also took the land of the local Papuan people and gave it to the Javanese, considering them more important than the locals. Directly applying peace and conflict theories and frameworks to the history of Papua brings to the fore three primary concepts: remembered grievances, direct and structural violence, and positive and negative peace. Remembered grievances allow the perpetuation of conflicts by providing some justification to a party to continue their conflict. In the case of West Papua, the Act of Free Choice once again stands as a prime example. The Act is a primary reason that West Papua is still not an independent nation state, and as such stands as a monument against Papuan nationalism. The events surrounding the Act and the outcome of the Act are of course remembered by the Papuans, and has subsequently perpetuated the fight for West Papua independence. The aforementioned transmigrasi policy and Act of Free Choice are egregious examples of structural violence against the people of West Papua, though direct violence through previous military conflicts, riots, assault and sexual assaults have also occurred in the region. These violent acts, as mentioned, are remembered, becoming grievances, and thus material to perpetuate the Papuan conflict. There has been no positive peace in West Papua for as long as 350 to 400 years. When there has been a lack of violence and thus an era of peace, it has been a negative peace, whereby conflict could restart at any time, with intense suspicion of both parties by both parties. Galtong, however, states that peace is the absence of violence. Thus it could be argued, West Papua has not been at peace since at least 1949.
We have got a lot of standard operating procedure and also ethical code, not to violate human rights, So the police today is very much different from the police since before 1998,
Yes.
When the police is being part of the armed forces.
The conflict analytical framework is a useful tool for the design, implementation, and evaluation of peace-building programs, whether it is for the prevention of armed conflict, attempting to bring war and violence to an end, or help societies recover in the aftermath of war and to attain greater justice and equality. The framework looks at 5 key themes. It looks at the actors, the root causes, the issues, scope and stage, power, resources and relations, and the history of the relationships. On the topic of West Papua, the actors include the indigenous population of Western New Guinea and the Indonesian provinces of Papua and West Papua on the island of New Guinea. The Indonesian government has been accused of conducting genocidal campaign against the indigenous inhabitants. Other actors and influences include the former Dutch colonial administration from the Netherlands, New Guinea in 1962, and the implementation of the Indonesian government in 1963. Western nations such as Britain and Australia support the Indonesian government and largely ignores the West Papuan conflict. The root causes on this issue is that New Guinea was divided into 2 parts since the partition was agreed to in 1895 by the Dutch, who controlled the western side of the island, and the British and Germans, who controlled the eastern side. The west side became under Indonesian rule in 1963, and the eastern part of the island became the independent state of Papua New Guinea. A number of issues revolving around this, such as how the Papuans were denied their right of self-determination in 1969, and when the Indonesian government established military posts, deployed thousands of soldiers, formed 9 districts, built governmental offices, and applied its law and regulations in West Papua. Countless of Indonesian military interventions have also caused thousands of West Papuan deaths. It's been an estimate of 100,000 people and is rising each day. Indonesia is also accused of numerous human rights abuses, as well as stealing wealth and resources for Papuans. For the issue scope and stage, the West Papuans have been denied basic rights of self-determination, experience cultural oppression, and is seen to be and uncivilized people by the Indonesian government. The Indonesian government believes it maintains sovereignty over West Papua and is part of the United Republic of Indonesia. So, in saying that, Indonesia considers West Papua to be a province of its own self. However, the West Papuan people do not see it like that and are fighting daily for their own independence, both democratically and with guerrilla warfare. Which leads us to power, resources and relations. So Indonesia currently maintains support for what it believes is its rights to maintain sovereignty over West Papua. Western countries such as America, Australia and Britain have generally favoured the Indonesian government's right to occupy the region. The governments from these countries do not openly support Indonesia, but allow it to happen by not saying anything or doing anything at all. So New Guinea and Indonesia have quite a history. New Guinea has been divided into two parts since the partition was agreed to in 1895 by the Dutch, who controlled the western side of the island, and the British and Germans, who controlled the eastern side. The eastern part of the island became an independent state of Papua New Guinea in 1975. However, the western part, which is West Papua, was colonised by the Dutch from 1855 to 1962 and has been under Indonesian rule since 1963. The denial of Papuans' right to self-determination in 1969, where the Indonesian government established military posts, deployed thousands of soldiers, formed 9 districts, built offices and applied its law and regulations in West Papua. The Indonesian government also systematically eradicated West Papua from schoolbooks, national symbolic items, such as the Morning Star flag, as well as text of the national anthem. Indonesia also removed West Papuan political parties and parliamentarians by administrating its own governmental election to instill its own government. Indonesia continues to face resistance of its rule from the Papuans, resulting in guerrilla warfare between the Indonesian military and Papuan militia groups, which has caused displacement and civil unrest. Positive peace is about creating and providing justice for all. Ideally, the dialogue needs to be mindful of past injustices while examining both sides of the narrative. Peace journalism, for example, is a positive step in that direction. And by applying journalistic ethics and removing biases, war and conflict based on false narratives can be drastically reduced or even removed completely. The philosophy, language and practice of non-violence provides a foundation of the promotion of peaceful dialogue in relation to West Papua. A quote from Martin Luther King Jr. summarizes this quite well. Peace is not merely the absence of some negative force, war, tension, confusion, but it is the presence of some positive force, justice, goodwill, the power of the kingdom of God.
We categorically reject the continuing insinuations in their statements. They clearly reflect an unfortunate lack of understanding of the history, current situation, and progressive developments in Indonesia, including in the provinces of Papua and West Papua, and also an unfriendly and rhetoric political maneuver.
West Papuan people now suffer from war paradigm situation from the conflict that they faced since 1960s. Violent conflicts are now the norm for the current generations. Violence had become embedded psychologically. Acceptance of violence reinforces the prevailing culture of violence. The situation is likely to remain so for years to come.
Because I know for a fact that since 2005, for example, the Indonesian government has changed the policy towards Papua from that focusing on security to one that addresses more the prosperity approach. And we know that the Indonesian government has worked very hard to promote a better welfare, better democracy, and of course better protections for human rights.
Through children, community, school and textbooks. there is quite a bit of a divide between the West Papuan people and Indonesian people. They see each other as others due to ethnical, religious, and cultural differences. West Papuans just see Indonesians as a colonizing power, stealing their resources. However, the colonial occupying actually helps West Papua's economy and infrastructures. West Papuan people are very oppressed and now suffer from lack of security rights, which is the protection against murder, massacre, torture, and rape, etc., and due process rights, which protect against abuses of the legal system, and liberty rights, protection of freedom in belief, expression, association, assembly, and movement, and political rights that protect the liberty to participate in politics, and equality rights, which guarantees equal citizenship and non-discrimination. And lastly, social rights, which is provision of education to all children and protections against severe poverty and starvation. And the all oppression nowadays receives a little to no coverage at all by the mainstream medias on this so-called slow-motion genocide.
Clearly, we still have some problems in Papua, but I think a lot of the claims have been quite exaggerated.
Primary interest of this stage is that of de-escalation and settlement, not to fuel and escalate the conflict and address the root causes to solve the issue, while being just for the both West Papuan people and Indonesian people. The strategies adopted by an organization as it begins to escalate a conflict have great import for the violent or non-violent trajectory of the conflict. Conflict escalation is often regarded as necessarily involving the use of violence, so peaceful non-violent measures are required. But there are many non-violent ways partisans can increase a conflict's scope and intensity. Fear campaign in West Papua, character-building violence by Indonesian government, great examples of which are the case where soldiers who raped a woman received lenient sentences of 3 to 9 months, and that the Indonesian government not acknowledging the arrests of more than 1,000 made independence rallies in West Papua. As a result of such cases, West Papuan people regard distrust as justified reality. This might also lead to violence justified as a form of protection by West Papuan people and escalate the conflict. The whole conflict stems and fueled from sense of injustice.
It's very, very important to recognize that there is a sea change in Indonesia in terms of outlook on democracy, on human rights, and whenever human rights violation occur in Papua is an exception to the rule and it's an aberration.
The Indonesian government's policy goal appears to be to paralyze the Papuan independence movement so it will not endanger Indonesia's territorial integrity. It is pursuing this goal through a security approach using military and intelligence operations. This approach creates unnecessary and violent tension between those Indonesians and Papuans who advocate the unitary state of the Republic of Indonesia and those Papuans who insist upon an independent Papua. As a result, resources in Jakarta and Papua are wasted on political measures that are reactionary, symbolic, and ultimately unreconcilable. The security approach does not address the heart of the conflict, rather it breeds further conflict and discontent. The Papuan Roadmap, a model for conflict resolution that adopts a justice approach, The aim of the roadmap is to provide new insight to decision makers within state institutions and the NGO community. It hopes to encourage a shift in approach to the conflict and to stimulate a willingness to take new steps to achieve justice for Papuans. The roadmap ultimately aims to promote an outcome whereby Indonesia enters into a new, constructive and progressive phase. The justice approach has 4 key dimensions: recognition, development, dialogue, and reconciliation. Recognition. Recognition involves Indonesia recognizing Papuans as traditional owners of the land. Recognition requires that Indonesia respond to a number of pressing problems that have caused the marginalization of Indonesian Papuans in Papua. Indonesian Papuans will soon become a minority in their own land due to migration. Papuans sense that they are under threat in their own land. Recognition must also focus on Papuans and their identity. It should include a social strategy of positive affirmation. It should support processes that will help individuals and local institutions compete more effectively in the market and be able to protect their interests in the struggle for control of resources. This will assist Papuans to negotiate more effectively for status and resources in this period of rapid social change to ensure Papuans enjoy the benefits of development. Government policy should provide the necessary bridge between preparing individual Papuans to compete independently and raising the general level of prosperity of Papuans. Recognition must also accommodate the symbols and other expressions of Papuan culture and treat them as part of the richness of the Indonesian culture. Development. Economic development has long been a government aim, but in practice has left many vulnerable groups behind. A new paradigm for development in Papua is necessary to raise the quality of life of Papuans to the level of other Indonesian citizens. Development programs must be able to meet the basic needs and rights of Papuans in education, health, and economic welfare. Papuans must have the capacity to participate effectively in and feel themselves part of the project of social change in Papua. This will help Papuans to feel comfortable in and proud of being a part of Indonesia. A new development paradigm for Papua is required because indigenous Papuans are not yet fully enjoying the benefits of being part of the Indonesian state in terms of receiving public services in education, health, infrastructure, and community empowerment. Little has been done so far to create intercultural links to facilitate understandings within indigenous communities of development initiatives or to prepare Papuans to participate actively in these initiatives, which impact on their social and economic conditions. Dialogue. Papuan mistrust and refusal to recognize the authority of Jakarta is largely based on an account of the history of Papua's decolonization that is contrary to the Indonesian state version of history. This has fed the tension between Papua and Indonesian identities. Different constructions of history and of the political status of Papua are the major barriers to relations between the central government and the Papuan people. These differing constructions have never been discussed in an open and frank manner. As a result, stigmatization, mistrust, and mutual rejection have deepened. For Papuans, dialogue has been a means to achieve the objective of an independent Papua. Jakarta, on the other hand, is averse to dialogue because it considers the demand for dialogue to be synonymous with the disintegration of the state. This aversion grows deeper when the proposal is for international dialogue. For Jakarta, Papua is a domestic matter. Dialogue can end the present political stalemate and cycle of violence and build mutual trust between Jakarta and Papua, and is imperative that it happens soon. Reconciliation. Reports show that state violence against Papuan civil society has occurred since the 1960s. Following the fall of Suharto in 1998, state violence towards Papuans has continued. The years between 1998 and 2006 were dominated by political violence perpetrated by the security forces against Papuans. Indonesia has failed to persecute and punish perpetrators or to restore the rights of the victims. In light of this, at the very least, Indonesia must acknowledge the truth as a first step on the path to reconciliation. Reconciliation can be pursued through two potential transitional justice mechanisms. The first is through prosecutions before the Human Rights Court, which is complex and may not obtain the results that one would like. The second possible mechanism involves the creation of a public record of events through a truth commission. Truth commissions focus on the experiences and testimonies of the victims, which form the basis for exposing the pattern, motive, and extent of the crimes. Truth commissions aim to create an historical record of the events, providing restitution and repatriations to victims and restoring their dignity. To be effective, a truth commission would need access to secret archives and to government officials past and present. It would need to create a public record of events and publish the names of both perpetrators and victims. The state must also acknowledge victims and their suffering through public apologies and statements of determination that such violence will not reoccur. Reconciliation along these lines will strengthen participatory democracy and reinforce basic human rights in Papua.
This is a historical moment in our struggle because 50 years our voice is buried under the carpet, but this is an emotional moment for me and for my people. And so this petition journey is a very difficult journey, but the petition now is we already handing over to the United Nations. That is mean that 1.8 million is a direct rejection of Indonesia illegal occupation. That's why we are already hold a referendum. So we want to show the Indonesia and outside world in the regionally, this is our people demand for referendum.
The central government must address these issues through open and genuine dialogue with Papuan leaders. A justice approach, as opposed to the security approach, offers a means of doing so. Pressure must be brought to bear to ensure the central government comes to the negotiating table. This is a long-term model and a realistic solution to be implemented in the next 10 to 20 years. Although with a push for a referendum and seeing what is occurring internationally in countries like Spain, this may occur earlier.